It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Julian Vance laughed as he flicked a glob of beluga caviar onto Elena Vance's faded cardigan in front of the charity board. The salty black pearls clung to the cheap wool, a dark stain against the cream fabric. Around the mahogany table, the city's elite shifted in their seats, some stifling smirks while others looked away, embarrassed by the display but too afraid of Julian's influence to speak up. "Oops," Julian said, his voice dripping with a mock concern that didn't reach his eyes. "I forgot you probably haven't seen caviar since the last time you went through the family trash, Elena. My hand just slipped." Elena didn't flinch. She felt the cold dampness of the appetizer seeping through her layers, but her expression remained as flat as the surface of the iced water in front of her. She reached for a paper napkin, slowly dabbing at the mess. The scent of Julian's cloying, expensive cologne, something with notes of oud and unearned confidence, wafted over her, thick enough to choke on. "Julian, really?" Lydia Vance tittered from the head of the table, her silk scarf fluttering as she waved a manicured hand. "Don't tease your sister. She's only here because I insisted we show a united front for the Thorne Vance Holdings Gala. Even if she does look like she's here to clean the floors rather than sit on the committee." Lydia's heels made a sharp, rhythmic clack against the Italian marble as she stood to adjust a floral arrangement. The sound was a reminder of the status Elena had supposedly lost 5 years ago when she'd been cast out of the family's inner circle. To them, she was the charity case, the sibling who had failed to live up to the Vance name, while Julian had soared as the golden boy of the industry. "She doesn't even have a seat at the table, Mother," Julian sneered, leaning back in his leather chair. He adjusted his gold Rolex, making sure the light caught the diamonds on the bezel. "She's a guest, a silent observer, a reminder of what happens when you lack the Vance instinct for success." Elena finally looked up. Her eyes met Julian's, and for a brief second his smirk faltered. There was a stillness in her that he had never been able to rattle. "The Vance instinct," she repeated softly. "Is that what we're calling the $30 million deficit in the quarterly projections, Julian?" The room went deathly silent. Julian's face flushed a deep, mottled red, the color of the vintage Bordeaux he'd been nursing. He slammed his hand onto the table, making the crystal glasses rattle. "You know nothing about the business. You're a librarian or a teacher or whatever pathetic little hobby you're using to pay your rent this month. I am the face of this company. I am the legacy." "Of course you are," Elena said, her voice calm, almost soothing. It was the tone one used with a toddler on the verge of a tantrum. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She didn't need to look at it to know it was Marcus Thorne. He would be checking in, making sure the final signatures for the merger, the real merger, the one Julian knew nothing about, were ready for the gala. The weight of the device against her hip felt like a loaded weapon. "Get out!" Julian hissed, leaning across the table until Elena could smell the wine on his breath. "You're an embarrassment to this committee. You're an embarrassment to the name. If you show up at the gala in 3 days looking like a beggar, I'll have security toss you into the street. Do you understand me?" Elena stood up slowly. She smoothed her stained cardigan, her fingers brushing against the hidden silk of the bespoke blouse she wore underneath, a small luxury she allowed herself, hidden from their prying, judgmental eyes. 3 days, Elena mused, looking around the room. She saw Sarah Jenkins, her secret executive assistant who was currently undercover as Julian's junior secretary, looking down at her notepad. Sarah's pen paused for a fraction of a second, a signal that the exchange had been recorded. "That's plenty of time for things to change, Julian." "Nothing is going to change for you, Elena," Lydia snapped, not looking up from her flowers. "You'll always be exactly where we put you, at the bottom looking up." Elena turned toward the door, her movements fluid and unhurried. As she reached the heavy oak entrance, she paused and looked back at her brother. Julian was already laughing again, regaling the board members with a story about his new yacht, his ego expanding to fill the vacuum he'd created. He looked every bit the king of the mountain. He had no idea the mountain was made of sand and the tide was coming in. Elena stepped out into the hallway and pulled her phone from her pocket. A message from Marcus Thorne sat on the screen. The SEC has the files. Detective Miller is briefed. The trap is set for Friday night. She felt a flicker of something warm in her chest, not rage, but a cold, hard satisfaction. She had spent 5 years playing the role of the failure, the cast-off, the charity case. She had watched them steal her ideas, her inheritance, and her dignity, all while Julian built a throne out of fraud and Lydia looked the other way. She reached the elevators and pressed the button. As the doors slid open, she caught her reflection in the polished chrome. She looked modest. She looked harmless. She looked like someone who had already lost. 3 days, Julian, she whispered to the empty car. She stepped inside and watched the doors close on the world that thought it owned her. She had one more phone call to make, one more ally to secure, and then the golden fraud would finally see what happened when the silent architect decided it was time to tear the building down. The countdown had begun, and Julian Vance was too busy celebrating his victory to realize he'd already lost everything. The next morning, the sunlight hit the breakfast room of the Vance estate with a clinical, unforgiving brightness. Elena Vance sat at the far end of the mahogany table, her fingers tracing the cold, heavy handle of a silver spoon. The air smelled of expensive Blue Mountain coffee, and the faint, floral scent of the lilies Lydia Vance insisted on having delivered fresh every day. Julian Vance entered the room like he owned the air within it, his silk robe billowing. He didn't look at his sister. He looked at the spread of imported cheeses and artisan breads as if they were tributes laid at his feet. "You're still here?" Julian asked, his voice thick with a casual morning cruelty. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, their father's chair, and signaled to the maid. "Maria, take the poached eggs away from that end of the table. Elena clearly isn't hungry. People who don't contribute to the family legacy shouldn't develop a taste for its rewards." Lydia didn't look up from her tablet, her thumbs scrolling through socialite news. "Don't be dramatic, Julian. She's just finding her footing." "She's been finding her footing for 5 years while I've been keeping Thorne Vance Holdings from sliding into the dirt," Julian snapped. He turned his gaze toward Elena, his eyes narrowing. "I saw you at the office yesterday. You looked like a charity case wandering the halls. It's embarrassing. In fact, it's so embarrassing that I've made a decision to help you move on." Elena took a slow, measured sip of her water. The glass was chilled, the condensation damp against her palm. "A decision? I'm liquidating the Thorne Vance Architectural Archives," Julian said, reaching for the coffee pot. "The blueprints, the original models, father's sketches, all of it. A private collector in Dubai is offering 8 figures. It's enough to finally clear the overhead on the new penthouse I'm eyeing." The spoon in Elena's hand stayed perfectly still, though her heart hammered a steady, rhythmic warning against her ribs. Those archives weren't just paper. They were the soul of the company she secretly ran from the shadows. They were the only things her father had truly cherished. "Those archives are part of the Thorne heritage, Julian," Elena said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the room. "They aren't yours to sell." Julian let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Everything with the Vance name on it is mine. You're just a passenger, Elena, a ghost in a house I built." He leaned forward, the smell of his expensive cologne cloying and aggressive. "The sale closes in 48 hours, right after the Founders' Gala. Consider it my final act of cleaning house." A sharp, metallic ping echoed through the room. Elena reached into the pocket of her modest cardigan and pulled out a burner phone. The screen glowed with a message from Sarah Jenkins. "The forensic audit is complete. Marcus has the signatures. The trap is set." "Who is texting you at this hour?" Lydia asked, finally looking up with a flick of her manicured brow. "Probably some debt collector." "Just a friend," Elena said softly. She looked at Julian, who was busy spreading marmalade with the focus of a man who believed he had already won. She felt a surge of cold, predatory calm. He didn't know that Marcus Thorne had already moved the legal title of those archives into a subsidiary he couldn't touch. He didn't know that Sarah had spent the night copying the very bank records that would prove Julian had been embezzling from the legacy fund for years. "You should wear something nice to the gala, Elena," Julian said, his mouth full of toast. It'll be the last time you're invited to anything with a red carpet. I'd hate for you to look as cheap as your bank account suggests. I'll be sure to choose something memorable, she replied. She stood up, leaving her untouched plate behind. As she walked toward the door, she felt the weight of the evidence on her phone, a digital guillotine waiting for its moment. Julian thought he was selling her history to fund his future, but he was really just handing her the rope. The countdown had narrowed. 48 hours until the Vance Anniversary Gala. 48 hours until the world realized that the man sitting in the high chair was nothing more than a thief in a silk robe, and the woman he'd spent years belittling was the one holding the keys to his prison. Julian! Elena paused at the doorway, her hand on the cold brass knob. What now? He groaned without looking up. Make sure you enjoy the coffee, she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. I hear the selection in the city's white-collar facilities is significantly less refined. She didn't wait for his retort. She stepped out into the hall, already dialing Marcus. The house of cards was trembling, and she was ready to provide the final breeze. 2 days later, the morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus Thorne's private study, casting long, sharp shadows across the mahogany desk. The room smelled of aged leather and the bitter, dark roast of double-shot espresso, a scent that now felt like the fragrance of an impending storm. Elena Vance sat perfectly still in a velvet armchair, her eyes fixed on the silver thumb drive resting between them. Marcus leaned back, his expression uncharacteristically grim. He tapped a thick manila folder that Sarah Jenkins had delivered by hand only an hour ago. She did it, Elena. Sarah found the physical backups Julian thought he'd incinerated 3 months ago. He called it the regular pot in the internal memos, a clever little euphemism for the slush fund he used to bypass the board's oversight. Elena reached out, her fingers brushing the cool, brushed metal of the drive. A small win, perhaps, but it felt like holding a lightning bolt. He always was fond of nicknames. He thought hiding the embezzlement in plain sight under a boring label would keep the auditors away. He didn't count on Sarah's memory. He didn't count on a lot of things, Marcus replied, his voice a low rumble. Detective Miller has already seen the preliminary digital trail. He's waiting for my signal. The SEC won't just fine him for this, Elena. They'll dismantle him. But we have to wait for the gala. We need the witnesses. Elena nodded, the weight of the secret pressing against her chest like a physical shield. 24 hours. I can wait 24 hours to see the look on his face when the regular pot boils over. Later that afternoon, she found herself standing in the foyer of the Vance family estate. The air here was different, stagnant, filled with the scent of lilies and the suffocating weight of a legacy Julian was currently selling off piece by piece. She had come to collect her father's antique watch, a small item Julian had graciously allowed her to keep before the house was officially transferred into his name. The sharp clink of crystal against stone echoed from the drawing room. Julian Vance stepped into the hall, looking every bit the golden fraud in a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than a mid-sized sedan. He held a glass of 20-year-old scotch, swirling the amber liquid with a casual, predatory grace. Still haunting the place, Elena? He asked, his voice dripping with a condescending pity that made her skin crawl. He didn't wait for an answer, instead stepping into her personal space to inspect her simple charcoal coat. You really should try harder for tomorrow night. It's the Anniversary Gala, not a funeral for your bank account. Though I suppose in your case, they're one and the same. Elena didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a calm that seemed to irritate him more than an insult ever could. I'm not worried about my clothes, Julian. I'm worried about the foundation of this house. It feels brittle. He let out a sharp, jagged laugh. Brittle? I've never been stronger. Thorne Vance Holdings is about to undergo a massive restructuring that will leave you as nothing more than a footnote in the family history. You're a clerical error I'm finally erasing. Is that what Mother thinks? Elena asked quietly. Lydia Vance appeared at the top of the grand staircase, her posture rigid, her diamonds catching the afternoon sun. She didn't look at Elena. Her eyes were fixed on her son with a blind, desperate devotion. Julian is doing what is necessary to protect our status, Elena. You've always been so difficult, so focused on the ledgers and not the prestige. Why can't you just be grateful he's keeping you on the payroll at all? The injustice of it was a physical heat in Elena's throat. She had spent a decade balancing the books Julian threw into chaos, yet in her mother's eyes, she was the burden and he was the savior. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, a blood betrayal that had been years in the making. I see, Elena said, her voice like a frozen lake. I'll remember that when the prestige starts to crumble, Mother. Julian smirked, taking a slow sip of his drink. Run along now, go find your little watch, and do try to find a dress that doesn't scream disinherited. I'd hate for the guests to think I don't take care of my staff. Elena turned and walked toward the study, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat on the marble floor. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. In her pocket, the silver thumb drive felt heavy and powerful. She had the regular pot, now, the undeniable proof of every dollar he'd stolen from the very woman currently defending him. She reached the study and found the small velvet box containing her father's watch. As she wound the dial, the steady tick-tick-tick sounded like a countdown. She checked her phone. A message from Sarah Jenkins appeared. The projector is synced. The guest list is confirmed. Everyone will be there. Elena walked out of the manor 10 minutes later, leaving Julian and Lydia to their champagne and their delusions. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. She climbed into her modest car and took a deep breath. The stage was set. The evidence was secured. The witnesses were invited. Julian thought he was preparing for his greatest triumph, his final ascent to the throne of the Vance Empire. He had no idea that he was actually meticulously decorating his own gallows. He had mocked her poverty, her modesty, and her silence, never realizing that the silence wasn't submission. It was the quiet before the strike. Tomorrow, she whispered to the empty car, her reflection in the rearview mirror showing a woman Julian wouldn't recognize. Tomorrow, the pot boils over. She pulled away from the curb, the countdown in her head reaching the final 20 hours. The Vance Anniversary Gala was going to be the most memorable event in the city's history, but not for the reasons Julian Vance expected. The thief in the silk robe was about to meet the architect of his ruin. The morning of the Vance Anniversary Gala arrived with a deceptive stillness. Elena sat in the sun-drenched breakfast room of the family estate, the scent of expensive dark roast coffee mingling with the cloying, floral notes of her mother's perfume. She watched the steam rise from her cup, her expression a mask of practiced neutrality. Julian burst into the room, his energy frantic and self-important. He was already dressed in a crisp, tailored silk shirt, his fingers dancing across his phone's screen as he barked orders at someone on the other end. He barely glanced at her before sliding into the chair opposite, his movements radiating the restless confidence of a man who believed he had already won. The caterers are behind schedule, and Thorne still hasn't confirmed his arrival time, Julian snapped, tossing his phone onto the linen tablecloth. He looked at Elena, his lip curling in a familiar, jagged sneer. I hope you found something halfway decent to wear tonight. I won't have you embarrassing me in front of the investors. There will be photographers from 3 different business journals, and I need the family image to be flawless. I have it handled, she replied quietly. Under the table, she felt the weight of the flash drive in her pocket, a small, cold piece of plastic that held the digital trail of his 5-year embezzlement scheme. It was a physical anchor in a room full of lies. Lydia Vance entered, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor like a ticking clock. She smoothed the hair away from Julian's forehead with a doting smile, completely ignoring her daughter's presence. My golden boy, she murmured, her voice thick with unearned pride. Tonight is the beginning of your legacy. The Vance Empire finally has the leader it deserves. It certainly is, Julian said, leaning back and adjusting his gold cufflinks. He looked at Elena again, his eyes narrowing with a dismissive coldness. Why are you even coming? You'll just spend the whole night hovering by the buffet like a ghost. You don't speak the language of people like us, Elena. You never have. You're a footnote, a background character in my success story. Elena set her spoon down. The silver clinked against the porcelain with the finality of a gavel striking a bench. "Julian," she said, her voice dropping an octave, gaining a weight that made Lydia pause mid-gesture. "I'm giving you one last opportunity. If there's anything you need to tell the board, any discrepancies in the Vance accounts, now would be the time. I can help you manage the fallout if you come clean before the gala begins." The room went silent for a heartbeat. Lydia gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if Elena had uttered a profanity. Julian, however, threw his head back and laughed. The sound was harsh, echoing off the high ceilings, full of the entitlement that had blinded him for years. "Come clean," he wheezed, wiping a mock tear from his eye. "Help me. You're a charity case living on a stipend I graciously sign off on every month. You don't even understand how a ledger works, let alone how to manage fallout. You've spent too much time in the basement archives, Elena. It's gone to your head." "I'm serious," she pressed, her gaze unwavering, her pulse steady. "Once the presentation starts tonight, there's no going back. The audit is complete, Julian. Every stone has been turned." "The audit is exactly where I want it to be," he countered, leaning over the table until she could smell the sharp peppermint of his mouthwash. "I've spent months making sure of that. You're just jealous because you're a shadow while I'm the sun. Now go find a dress that doesn't look like it came from a clearance rack. That's an order." He stood up, signaling the end of his patience. Lydia followed him out, whispering about his brilliance and the bright future ahead, leaving Elena alone in the quiet room. Her phone buzzed in her lap. A message from Marcus Thorne appeared on the screen. "The SEC team is briefed. Detective Miller will be in the 4th row, plainclothes. The projector is slave to your tablet. Do we proceed with the final slide?" Elena looked out the window at the manicured lawn, where workers were already erecting the white silk tents for the evening's festivities. The traps were set. The bait was taken. Julian's refusal to heed her warning wasn't just arrogance. It was the final signature on his own professional death warrant. She typed a single word in response: "Proceed." She stood up, smoothed her modest skirt, and walked toward the stairs. There were 6 hours left until the first guest arrived. 6 hours until the golden fraud realized that the sister he had spent a lifetime dismissing was the only person who truly knew the price of his crown. The countdown had reached its final stretch, and for the first time in years, Elena felt the cold, sharp clarity of justice. The evening arrived with a deceptive stillness, the sunset painting the white silk tents in shades of bruised purple and gold. From the second-floor balcony, Elena Vance watched the first fleet of black town cars snake up the long, winding driveway of the family estate. The air was thick with the cloyingly sweet scent of 5,000 imported lilies Julian had ordered to establish the right atmosphere. To anyone else, it was the smell of a celebration. To her, it smelled like a funeral. "The server is live," a quiet voice said behind her. Elena turned to see Sarah Jenkins standing in the doorway. Her assistant was dressed in a sharp, inconspicuous black cocktail dress, her expression unreadable. She held a small, encrypted tablet out like a peace offering. "Marcus is already downstairs," Sarah continued, her voice dropping an octave. "He's positioned near the tech booth. Detective Miller and his team are in the 4th row, just as we discussed. They're wearing the security detail's colors. Julian hasn't noticed a thing. He's too busy admiring his own reflection in the champagne fountain." Elena took the tablet, the cold glass a sharp contrast to the humid evening air. She swiped the screen, watching the data streams flicker, years of Julian's systematic theft, the offshore accounts, the forged signatures, and the hollowed-out shells of the companies he had bled dry. It was all there, compressed into a single, devastating file labeled Vance Legacy. "Thank you, Sarah," she said, her voice steady. "Go downstairs. Make sure the regular guests are comfortable. I want the room full when the curtain rises." As Sarah disappeared, Elena smoothed the fabric of her dress. It was a simple, charcoal gray silk, expensive but understated, designed to blend into the shadows. She wasn't the star of this show, she was the director. Descending the grand staircase, the sensory assault of the gala hit her with full force. The thrum of a string quartet fought against the rising volume of 300 socialites and investors. The smell of expensive perfume and aged scotch was suffocating. In the center of the ballroom, Julian Vance stood like a king among subjects. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than the annual salary of the janitors who cleaned his offices. He was holding court near a towering ice sculpture of the company's logo, his arm draped casually around their mother. Lydia Vance looked radiant, her diamonds catching the light as she laughed at one of Julian's rehearsed jokes. "Ah, there she is." Julian's voice boomed across the floor as he spotted Elena. He didn't move toward her, he waited for her to come to him, a silent assertion of his perceived dominance. The invisible woman finally decides to join the party. Lydia smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Elena, dear, you look functional. Doesn't she look functional, Julian?" "Like a well-oiled gear in the machine," Julian sneered, sipping from a crystal flute. He leaned in closer, the scent of his heavy, sandalwood cologne invading her space. "I hope you've checked the catering list one last time, sister. I noticed the caviar was slightly chilled. We wouldn't want the Thorne Vance anniversary to be marred by your lack of attention to detail, would we?" "Everything is exactly where it needs to be, Julian," Elena replied, her tone perfectly neutral. "I've made sure the presentation is unforgettable." Julian chuckled, a sound of pure, unearned confidence. "Good, because tonight isn't just about the past, it's about the future, my future. I'm announcing the expansion into the European markets. The contracts are already signed." "Are they?" Elena asked, a small ghost of a smile touching her lips. "You always were so fast with a pen." "Speed is what wins the race, Elena, something you never quite understood." He dismissed her with a flick of his wrist, turning back to a group of high-net-worth investors. "Now, if you'll excuse us, some of us have a legacy to build. Why don't you go find Marcus? He's been looking as grim as a tax auditor all night. You two can go hide in a corner and talk about spreadsheets." Elena watched him walk away, his laughter echoing against the marble floors. She felt the weight of the tablet in her clutch, a hidden weapon that Julian was too arrogant to even suspect. She moved through the crowd, her eyes locking briefly with Marcus Thorne near the back of the room. He gave a single, sharp nod. He was standing next to a man in a dark suit who looked entirely too alert for a guest, Detective Miller. The tension in the room was a living thing, a coiled spring waiting for the release. Elena found a spot near the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains, watching as Julian climbed the small, raised stage at the front of the ballroom. He tapped the microphone, the sharp thud-thud silencing the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice projected with the practiced charisma of a man who believed his own lies. "Friends, family, and partners, tonight we celebrate 50 years of the Vance name. But more importantly, we celebrate the vision that has brought us to this moment of unprecedented growth." Behind him, a massive projector screen hummed to life, glowing with a soft blue light. It was meant to show a montage of the company's successes, the buildings, the deals, the smiling faces of the board. Elena saw Sarah Jenkins slip toward the tech booth. She saw Marcus move toward the main exit, signaling the plainclothes officers to move into position. The witnesses were all in place, the board members, the press, the city's elite, and the mother who had spent a lifetime choosing the wrong child. Julian spread his arms wide, the light of the projector casting a long, distorted shadow across the floor. "I've often said that a company is only as strong as the man who leads it, and tonight, I want to show you exactly what that strength has built." He turned toward the screen, his face lit with a triumphant glow, ready for the first slide of his grand presentation. Elena felt her heart rate slow to a calm, rhythmic beat. She reached into her clutch and pressed a single button on the tablet. "Go ahead, Julian," she whispered into the silence of the room. "Show them everything." The screen flickered. The blue light vanished, replaced by a stark, high-definition scan of a wire transfer receipt from a Cayman Islands account. Julian's signature sat at the bottom, bold and unmistakable. The room didn't erupt. It did something far worse. It went utterly, terrifyingly silent. Julian's smile didn't vanish. It froze. a mask of confusion beginning to crack as he stared at the document that shouldn't have existed. He looked at the screen, then back at the audience, his hand still raised in a gesture of triumph that had suddenly become a confession. The countdown had ended. The first slide was only the beginning. Elena didn't move. She let the silence stretch until it became a physical weight in the grand ballroom. The hum of the projector was the only sound, a steady, mechanical drone that seemed to vibrate against the crystal flutes held by the stunned guests. Julian's hand, still clutching a microphone he'd been using to boast moments ago, began to tremble. The high-definition scan of the Cayman Islands wire transfer glowed behind him, casting his shadow, twisted and small, across the undeniable proof of his own theft. The scent of expensive lilies, meant to celebrate his triumph, now felt cloying like the air in a funeral parlor. Julian's mouth worked, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air, his skin turning a sickly mottled gray. "This is a fabrication," he finally croaked, his voice cracking under the pressure of 100 judging eyes. He turned to the crowd, his eyes wild, searching for a single friendly face. "Elena is a bitter, jealous failure. She's hacked the system. Marcus, tell them. Tell them this is a lie." Marcus Thorne didn't move to help him. Instead, the chief legal officer stepped into the light, his expression as cold as a winter morning. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at Elena and nodded. "The documents are authenticated, Julian," Marcus said, his voice carrying to the very back of the hall. "Every cent you funneled out of the Vance estate and into those offshore accounts has been tracked. We've been watching the digital trail for 6 months. You didn't just steal from the company. You stole from your own blood." Julian's face didn't just pale, it collapsed. The arrogance that had sat like a mask over his features for decades shattered, leaving behind a raw, naked terror. His eyes went hollow and glass-like, darting frantically as he realized there was no exit. His jaw slackened, his lower lip quivering as the reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. His skin took on the waxy, translucent sheen of a man who had seen his own ghost. He looked at Lydia, but his mother was already shrinking away, her hand over her mouth, her eyes darting toward the shadows as if to distance herself from the radioactive ruin of her favorite child. Julian's shoulders slumped, his expensive Italian suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too large for the man cowering inside it. He was no longer the golden fraud. He was a cornered animal realizing the trap had been set years ago. "I didn't have to hack anything, Julian," Elena said, her voice low but perfectly clear. She walked toward the stage, her modest heels clicking with a lethal, rhythmic precision on the marble floor. "I built the infrastructure you tried to exploit. Did you really think I wouldn't notice my own code being used to bypass the internal audits?" She turned toward the back of the room, where a man in a sharp, nondescript suit stepped forward from the shadows. "Detective Miller, I believe you have everything you need." The detective held up a badge, the silver catching the light of the chandeliers. "Julian Vance, I'm with the SEC. We have a warrant for your arrest regarding securities fraud, grand larceny, and embezzlement." The room erupted into a cacophony of whispers and sharp gasps. Lydia Vance slumped into a chair, her face buried in her hands, while the board members Julian had spent the evening courting began to physically back away from him. It was a literal tide of rejection. Sarah Jenkins stood by the exit, holding Elena's coat, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips as she watched the golden boy finally lose his luster. Elena didn't stay to watch the handcuffs click shut. She didn't need to hear the excuses Julian was finally starting to babble or see the tears he was shedding for himself. She stopped at the edge of the stage, looking down at the brother who had spent a lifetime trying to make her feel small. "You always said I didn't belong in this world, Julian," she whispered, loud enough only for him to hear. "You were right. I don't belong in your world of lies." She paused, her eyes like flint. "I own the one you're leaving behind." She turned on her heel and walked out, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind her, cutting off the sound of her brother's desperate pleas and the cold, professional voice of the law. Outside, the night air was crisp and clean, and for the first time in years, Elena could finally breathe. The heavy oak doors had barely settled into their frames when the sound of Julian Vance's first scream tore through the wood. It wasn't a cry of protest, but the high, thin sound of a man watching his entire reality dissolve in real time. Inside the ballroom, the air was thick with the scent of spilled vintage scotch and the ozone of a dozen camera flashes. The prestigious guests who had spent the evening laughing at Julian's jokes now pulled back like he was suddenly contagious. Julian Vance's face was a map of collapsing ego. The vibrant, sun-kissed tan he cultivated so carefully seemed to curdle, turning a sickly, translucent gray under the ballroom's crystal chandeliers. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung loose, a hinge broken by the weight of the truth. His eyes, usually sharp with practiced condescension, were suddenly wide and bloodshot, darting frantically from the handcuffs on his wrists to the giant screen behind him. A fine sheen of sweat broke across his forehead, matting his perfectly coiffed hair into greasy clumps that stuck to his skin. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like a cornered animal, his upper lip twitching in a rhythmic, involuntary pulse of pure terror. "This is a mistake," Julian shouted, his voice cracking as Detective Miller tightened the grip on his arm. He turned his desperate gaze toward the front row. "Mother, tell them. Elena is unstable. She's forged all of this to get back at me for the inheritance." Lydia Vance stood frozen, her hand pressed against the strand of pearls at her throat. For years, she had looked at her son with a blind, doting pride, but as she stared at the bank statements still glowing on the projector, records showing Julian had drained her own personal accounts to fund his offshore gambling, that pride vanished. She didn't move toward him. Instead, she took a half step back, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. The betrayal was a physical weight, visible in the way her shoulders slumped. "I can't help you, Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising murmur of the crowd. "You took everything. You even took from me." The room's power dynamic had shifted so violently the air felt thin. Arthur Sterling, the venerable board chair who had once called Julian the future of the industry, signaled to the security team with a sharp, disgusted wave of his hand. Nearby, Mrs. Gable, the city's most influential socialite, turned her back entirely, shielding her eyes as if the sight of Julian's disgrace was a smudge on her silk gown. Marcus Thorne stepped forward, his silhouette tall and imposing against the chaos. He didn't raise his voice, yet the room went silent the moment he spoke. "The board has already held an emergency vote, Julian. You were removed as CEO effective 4 minutes ago. Your access to all company accounts has been terminated." Julian began to thrash, the metallic clinking of the handcuffs echoing through the hall. "You can't do this. I built this. Elena Vance is nothing. She's a ghost. You're taking the word of a girl who spends her life hiding in the basement. The ghost is the reason Thorne Vance Holdings still exists," Marcus replied coldly. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single, crimson-sealed document. "And as her chief legal officer, I've been instructed to inform you that Elena has also filed a freeze on the family trust. Every cent you thought you were going to use for your defense is currently locked under a court order." This was the final blow. Julian's knees buckled. He would have hit the floor if Detective Miller hadn't hauled him back up. The arrogance that had been his armor for 30 years had been stripped away, leaving behind a small, frightened boy who had never learned how to be a man. Sarah Jenkins stood near the stage, her arms crossed, watching the scene with the grim satisfaction of someone who had spent years cleaning up Julian's messes. She adjusted the lapel of her blazer, her eyes following him as the officers began to lead him toward the side exit. "Wait!" Julian lunged toward the doors Elena had exited through just moments before. "Elena, you ungrateful bitch, I made you. You'd be nothing without the Vance name." His scream was cut short as the detectives shoved him through the service entrance. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the projector. In the hallway, away from the prying eyes of the elite, Elena Vance stood by the tall windows. She watched the blue and red lights of the police cruisers pulse against the wet pavement below. She could hear the muffled chaos from the ballroom, the sound of her mother's sobbing, and the frantic, hushed tones of investors trying to save their reputations. She felt the weight of the small, silver key in her pocket, the key to the office Julian had occupied for 5 years. She didn't feel the rush of joy she had expected. Instead, there was only a profound, quiet clarity. The sleeping lion had finally woken up, and in the process, she had burned the only world she had ever known to the ground. Marcus Thorne appeared at her side, his presence a steady anchor in the aftermath of the storm. "It's done, Elena. The SEC has the physical ledgers." "He won't be getting out on bail." She nodded, her reflection in the glass looking stronger than she felt. "And my mother." "She's asking for you," Marcus said softly. "The board members are too. They're terrified, Elena. They realize now that Julian was the face, but you were the brain. They want to know if the company will survive the night." Elena turned away from the window, her eyes like flint. She thought of the years of insults, the wine poured on her dresses, the way Julian had laughed while he stole her work. She looked at the heavy doors of the ballroom, knowing that if she walked back in there, she would no longer be the quiet architect. She would be the master of their fates. "Let them wait," she said, her voice steady and cold. "They've spent enough time ignoring me. A few more hours won't kill them." She walked toward the main exit, her heels echoing with a new, authoritative rhythm. She had spent a lifetime in Julian's shadow, but as she stepped out into the cool night air, she realized the shadow was gone. The sun was finally rising on a world she had built with her own hands, and for the first time, everyone knew her name. 6 months had passed since the night the ballroom doors had closed on the old version of Elena Vance. In the high-altitude silence of the Thorne Vance Holdings executive suite, the air smelled of expensive sandalwood and the crisp, metallic tang of an impending storm. Elena stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection in the glass, a sharp contrast to the woman who had once worn wine-stained dresses and bowed her head to insults. She wore a charcoal gray suit now, the fabric so fine it felt like a second skin, and a watch that cost more than her brother's former luxury sedan. A soft chime announced a visitor. Marcus Thorne stepped into the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick silk rug. He didn't carry the frantic energy of the previous months. Instead, he moved with the steady confidence of a man whose side had finally won. He placed a leather-bound folder on her mahogany desk. "The final sentencing for Julian Vance was processed this morning," Marcus said, his voice level. 5 years, Elena." Between the embezzlement and the securities fraud, the judge wasn't inclined to be merciful, especially after Detective Miller presented the secondary ledger you found. Elena didn't turn around immediately. She watched a single raindrop trail down the glass, a lonely path against the vast city skyline. "And the restitution." "Everything is gone," Marcus replied. "The penthouse, the offshore accounts, the vintage car collection. It barely covers half of what he siphoned from the firm, but the court has frozen his remaining assets to pay the legal fees. He's currently living in a state-appointed transition apartment until his reporting date next week." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of a legacy that had been dismantled and rebuilt. Elena finally turned, her eyes like polished flint. She had won. She was the CEO of the most powerful holding company in the region, her name respected in every boardroom from here to London. But the victory felt different than she had imagined. It wasn't a roar, it was a cold, steady hum. The door opened again, but this time there was no chime. Lydia Vance marched in, her face a mask of frantic desperation that even her expensive Botox couldn't hide. She looked smaller than she had 6 months ago, her designer coat hanging off her shoulders as if she had forgotten how to carry the weight of her own status. "Elena, you have to stop this," Lydia cried, her voice cracking as she ignored Marcus entirely. "I just saw Julian. He's in a room the size of a closet. He doesn't have a car, he doesn't have his staff. He's eating frozen meals, for God's sake. You've had your fun, you've shown everyone you're the boss. Now tell the lawyers to drop the secondary charges. He's your brother." Elena sat behind her desk, the movement slow and deliberate. She didn't offer her mother a seat. "Julian isn't in that room because of me, Mother. He's there because he thought he could build a kingdom on a foundation of theft. He didn't just steal from the company, he stole 5 years of my life. It was just money, Lydia snapped, her entitlement flaring up like a dying ember. We are the Vances. We don't belong in courtrooms and cramped apartments. If you don't help him, the family name will never recover. The family name is doing just fine, Elena said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low register. It's associated with growth, integrity, and the most successful quarter in this firm's history. It's Julian's name that is the problem. And as of yesterday, I've legally petitioned to drop the Vance from the corporate branding. It will simply be Thorn Holdings. Lydia gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if she'd been physically struck. You're erasing us, after everything I did for you. You didn't do anything for me, Elena countered, standing up. The power dynamic in the room shifted instantly. Lydia actually took a step back, her heels clicking unevenly on the hardwood border of the rug. You watched him pour wine on me and laughed. You watched him steal my designs and called it teamwork. You chose the golden fraud over the daughter who was actually doing the work. Now, you can go live in that closet with him if you're so concerned about his comfort. Security will show you out. As Lydia was escorted out, her protests echoing down the hall, Elena felt a sharp pang of something she hadn't expected. Grief. Not for Julian, and certainly not for the lifestyle they had lost, but for the girl she had been, the one who had genuinely hoped her mother would one day be proud of her. That girl was gone, buried under the cold reality of corporate takeovers and legal battles. Later that evening, Elena walked down the hall to the main boardroom. It was empty, the long table gleaming under the recessed lighting. She walked to the head of the table and looked at the chair Julian had once occupied with such unearned arrogance. It was empty now, a silent testament to a fallen king. She ran her hand over the cool leather of the head chair. She had the office, the title, and the fortune. She had delivered the karma Julian deserved, stripping him of every status symbol he had used as a weapon against her. She had won, but as she looked out at the darkening city, she realized the cost of her crown. She was the master of her fate, but she was standing in a world she had built entirely alone. Elena sat in the chair, the silence of the room absolute. She picked up her gold pen, clicked it once, and began to sign the documents that would finalize the new era. The shadow was gone, but the light was colder than she ever could have known.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.